Hi, good day. We can start. We're on time now. People are still logging in. Mark, you can shut down the note, please. From our side, I want to say welcome to everybody. We have some housekeeping that we look at. The primary part around this is for everyone except the speakers to please keep their videos and their mics off. Further one is that this is being recorded. And then from there we can move on. Please note the warning about the power outages that we have. From our side as well, there will perhaps be a bump just after 1400, but Hussein and myself will try to back up each other on this, that we can move from there. Okay, there the power just came up on this side. We are aiming to finish by 1600 hours with the event, and we will keep to the program, the way in which it was set and uploaded and posted to everybody. We therefore starting directly after this with the opening, and then we will keep to the program via the keynote speaker, the 3 panels with panel chairs and the speakers, and end up hopefully by 1600 hours. I would therefore like to start off. I'm just trying to get my screen sorted after the power came on now. Okay, now we're okay, we're good to go. So immediately after this, I will hand over to the Dean of the Faculty of Military Science, Professor CGAS, who will do the opening, after which I will move on to introduce Professor Anang. I want to ask the Dean of the Faculty, Professor CGAS, who is Dean, Faculty of Military Science of Stellenbosch University. He's also the Acting Director of SIGLA. Professor CGAS holds a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Cape Town. He also specializes in terms of matters of viscosity related to mathematics that he's qualified in. At the moment, he's serving a further term as the Dean of the Faculty, and you can see much of what he has to say or what we want to know about him is in his brief bio that is part of the program as you move down. So, Professor CGAS, if you're ready, you can commence with the opening for a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you for that short brief. And good afternoon, the rest of the colleagues. As you heard from Francois, my name is Professor CGAS. I'm the current Dean at the Faculty of Military Science. And thank you also to all of you for your attendance in this conference. It is an honor for me as the Dean to open this webinar, which basically explore topics around the coups, extremism, and poor governance in our beloved continent. In my capacity, as Francois indicated earlier on, as the interim director for SIGLA, I must indicate to all of you, this is the theme that falls within our scope, and we are honored by your attendance in this seminar. As academics and practitioners, we cannot always do it alone. We rely on your expertise as well. And this seminar and webinar is basically giving us that platform in which we can share our views, especially when coming to issues around coups in our continent, in some certain areas and regions, is quite a standard practice. And then, of course, next door to our doorstep in Mozambique, we know the issues of extremism is a big challenge in that space. And then I think, of course, you as academics will be in a position to debate it better than I do. Now, again, let me thank Professor Frey and Professor Solomon for putting this webinar together. Furthermore, each one of you, your attendance is duly acknowledged, is quite very important. that we're going to listen to your views around these issues. And again, our esteemed colleagues that we're constantly working together, they are also online. Colleagues like Professor Anning, Professor Mandra, Professor Moriti, Professor Kodze, and the colleagues from UNISA, as well as my colleagues from the Faculty of Military Science, and all important guest speakers that are going to deliver their talk today. You are duly acknowledged in this conference. Furthermore, I must highlight that since I come from the military establishment, when you run the risk of forgetting other names, we simply rely on all protocol is also observed. On those few words, Chairperson, let me declare this webinar open, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. I do know what your program looks like, and I have appreciation that you took the time to quickly open this event and participate and listen while you can. So a word of appreciation to you as well around this. I want to move on because the keynote speaker for today is Professor Anning. He is from the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Center in Ghana. If I'm not mistaken, he is at Uppsala University in Sweden, if I'm not mistaken. Professor Anning is full professor and the director of the Faculty of Academic Affairs at the Kofi Annan Center in Ghana. You can also read about him in his bio that is in the program that you've got, about all the positions and the work that he's doing, and his strong connection to Uppsala University in Sweden. So, Professor Anning, from my side, if you're ready, you can take the floor. I would also ask the delegates that if you want to know something, to please look at the bios that we've listed. There you are. Welcome, Kwezi. We're looking forward to listening to you and your expertise, because I know from previous experience it's worth the time to listen to what you have to say. Welcome.
Well, very many thanks, Francois. And let me say what a great pleasure it is to have colleagues, to discuss what I perceive to be a very timely discussion. And certainly also to the Dean for taking time off to open this webinar. Francois, I've just come back to Accra briefly, and I'll be heading back to Uppsala quite soon. So today's conversation, I've titled my keynote, Exploring the Interfaces Between Coups, Violent Extremism, and Poor Governance in the Sahel. And I've divided this into 4 parts. First, seeking to understand what I term as the nature of resurgent coup d'etats and the challenge. Secondly, exploring the underlying and mutating factors contributing to these developments. And then asking myself a very prescient question. Are there certain wider geostrategic developments leading to these coup d'etats? And what are their implications for the ECOWAS sub-region? I conclude by exploring ECOWAS's role as a norm entrepreneur and how its principles, values, and norms are being challenged by these emerging developments. So the optimism of West Africa's post-1992 democratic changes, to be fair, have not translated into deepening institutional processes, effective economic management, and governance of state resources. These, in a sense, have all contributed to creating a situation where the initial optimism of the immediate post-1992 changes have been replaced by an increasingly confrontational type of politics between an old political elite bent on exercising power and a majority of the electorate, increasingly young, frustrated that their contributions to and opportunities for engagement in how their countries are governed have been progressively narrowed by the manipulative control over state institutions. These, I argue, have contributed to the surge in successful coups and failed coup d'etats in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. I've made this argument very strongly that by June 2023, if we have one more successful coup d'etat in West Africa, or a reasonably successful coup attempt, the edifice that we call democracy in West Africa will begin to crumble. This is partly because of political extremism and terrorism, which have created obstacles to democratic progress in several West African states. The democratic processes, particularly in the Sahel, have stalled or have become fragmented due to the continued prevalence of armed and insurgent groups. With the spread of democracy and regularly scheduled elections, I think all of us had this expectation that this would result in the near disappearance of military coups in the region. However, the pervasive and persistently low levels of economic growth, and particularly the deliberate manipulation of economic growth figures by governments in West Africa and the Sahel, associated with high levels of poverty, and then which are symptomatic of the social grievances and the manipulation of constitutional term limits, have all contributed to creating enabling environments for the re-entry of the military into the center of national politics, further leading to coup d'etats in the sub-region. These military coups, I argue, are challenging both political order and democratic processes, and the voluntary principles inherent in ECOWAS's protocols, and somehow is leading to a propensity to abuse and curtail the rights and freedoms of citizens and also distort the operations of the state. These are issues resulting from bad governance practices, resulting in weak state institutions undermining democracies. Such political instability and insecurity is leading or has led to the capture by the military of power in Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, and in Guinea. Whilst for Burkina Faso and Mali particularly, and increasingly in Niger, the common denominator for the instability relates to coup d'etats or to the presence of Islamic or violent extremism. There are other countries in the sub-region also facing such threats, but that are not experiencing violent extremism. So this raises a wider empirical and theoretical question as to what is it that is really driving the resurgence of coups. And therefore, it leads me to raise a question about the possible correlations between extremism and coups. And they do not provide for very easy answers. But from where I sit, there seems to be a mutually beneficial relationship amongst the jihadist groups or violent extremists, coup plotters, and what I term as an emerging geopolitical scramble for allies in the Sahel and Greater West Africa. While this emerging relationship may be tenuous, these linkages are contributing to protracted insecurity, and they are not in doubt. The complex, evolving relationship between violent extremists and military coups in the Sahel, I argue, can be best understood in how the activities of the former preempts the emergence of the latter. While the correlations between violent extremists as a direct antecedent for military coups cannot be discounted, I argue that there are two possible intervening variables that must be considered. First, an increasingly widespread distaste for the presence of France in West Africa and the Sahel. Anti-French sentiments has seen a rise in Mali and regionally in West Africa, in Senegal, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, and in Benin, leading to French withdrawal of its troops from Mali, and now Burkina Faso has given them the marching orders with a 4-week timetable. Second is the meddlesome behavior of Mr. Putin, whose proxy group have taken up some of the functions left by the French through its Wagner group. So what is the convergence of the multiple factors resulting in this epidemic of chaos and the coup enterprise? And I'll race through this very quickly. The latest coup in Burkina Faso, the third in the country within 8 months, creates a disturbing development. But the rationales leading to the Burkina coup and the coup d'etat in Mali are also found in Guinea, in Niger, in northeastern Nigeria, in northern Ghana. So there seems to be a widespread fundamental structural challenge that states are facing, that democracies is struggling to deal with. These relate to the high levels of poverty and inequality, of high levels of unemployment, particularly relating to the youth, endemic corruption, creating a mistrust between the political class and the generality of the population, illiteracy, poor economic and political governance, an inability to manage the destabilizing conflicts in the Sahel, and of course, all these compounded by a military that perceives itself as guardians of the state and the last hope, and therefore creating a narrative that says when politics fails, the military has a legitimate right to intervene. This needs, I will argue, a certain reflection on the historicity of coups in West Africa. The region has the highest number of coup d'etats, accounting for almost 45% of all coups on the continent. Since 2010, there have been 20 coup attempts and successful ones in the West Africa and Sahel alone. And since 2019, 7 successful and 4 failed coup attempts. The Sahel situation is worsened by illicit trafficking, crime, and extremism, alongside global power competition. And the Burkina case is very symptomatic of the emerging global power competition. Within hours of Burkina Faso's second coup, the Wagner Group's Yevgeny Prigozhin was among the first to congratulate the new junta, arguing that the recent coup, quote, could be a gateway to a more assertive Russian policy towards the Sahel. Burkina Faso, as I've said earlier on, has subsequently asked the French to leave. We've seen the active role of the Wagner Group in Mali. The Ghana government a couple of weeks ago was in Washington to complain about the Wagner Group's performance or behavior along its northern borders. Does this raise a larger question that Burkina Faso's coup and the coup in Mali could be the first examples of an assertive Russia playing a part in instigating coups rather than capitalizing rather than just capitalizing on pre-existing unrest? How should we understand and interpret the confluence of factors that is leading to what I term as a re-emergence of the struggle for influence with France, US, Russian, Chinese, Turkish influence building in West Africa and the Sahel. Just how important are these states and their roles on the continent? And I want to focus a little bit on the role of Russia, precisely because there's this resurgence of Russia in terms of mining, in terms of oil exploration, and the role particularly of its Wagner Group. How do we explain this renewed Russian gravitation towards the continent? And how is it going to impact on stability? Mr. Putin showed very little interest on the continent in the early 2000s. I argue that the imposition of Western sanctions in 2014 in the aftermath of the Crimea annexation motivated Moscow to renew previously lessened geopolitical friendships and business opportunities. Since 2019, Russia has been bolstering its presence in at least 13 of the continent's countries through a hybrid instrumentalization of political, economic, and military influence, building new relations with existing rulers, striking military deals, grooming a new generation of leaders, and also, of course, undercover agents. Moscow sees its presence on the continent in very broad terms, building on ties from Soviet times, and perceives the continent as one of its foreign policy priorities. Speaking very often about offering political and diplomatic support, defense and security help, economic assistance, disease control, humanitarian relief assistance, and educational and vocational training. The boosting of these diplomatic links, I argue, is contributing to destabilizing the sub-region. So how do all these coups, how should we understand them within the context of West Africa's post-1992 efforts?
Professor Aning, sorry for interrupting. We lost your sound here. If you can just check.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I think my hand might have pressed something. Yeah, okay. So I want to come to the fourth part, which is how these developments, the rising coups in the Sahel, the wider attempts in West Africa, the geopolitical games being played, how are these coming together in complex ways to challenge ECOWAS's endeavors as a democracy or a democracy norm entrepreneur? And I want to focus my conversations now on ECOWAS's protocol on good governance and on democracy. This particular protocol spells out specific guidelines relating to that every accession to power must be made through free, fair, and transparent elections, that there is zero tolerance for power obtained by unconstitutional means, and particularly that the armed forces must be apolitical and must be under the command of a legally constituted legal authority, that no serving member of the armed forces may seek to run for elective office. If we see ECOWAS's role as a norm entrepreneur in a regime theoretical light, then the argument is that under regimes, principles are inviolate and are the guidepost to how member states must behave or how these principles moderate member states' behavior. Therefore, what these schools are doing is that they are raising a fundamental question of several fundamental questions concerning levels of compliance with the principles to which member states in ECOWAS and then these Sahel states have voluntarily signed on to. In a sub-region, the effective application of the rule of law seems to be hindered by challenges relating to impunity, delays in the prosecution of crimes relating or resulting from judicial bureaucracies, and insurgencies that are underpinned by banditry, terrorism, and violent extremism, as I had earlier on argued. All these are contributing to a growing sense of societal injustice and contributing to the loss of public trust in the ability of the state to provide timely and fair protection and justice. So you would notice that both in Mali and Burkina Faso, and also in Guinea, and in the failed attempts in Guinea-Bissau and elsewhere, the militaries have used corruption, lack of social justice, and lack of inclusion in political processes, and the state's inability to effectively resist the expansion of violent extremism as the rationales for their unjustifiable intervention. Furthermore, the problems of corruption, lack of manpower delay, and high cost of justice are all contributing to a tainted justice system. Judicial apparatuses have not been insulated from ethnic considerations, political affiliation, rule of law, and justice. Particularly the rule of law in the Sahel countries have been attributed to a consistent, deliberate repression of what I term as the watchdogs of democracy, including the media and civil society organizations. So let me try and make a couple of concluding remarks. The ECOWAS enterprise, in which it seeks to present itself as a norm entrepreneur, and the principles inherent in its protocols provide a normative framework that seeks to establish democracy in the Sahel and the greater West Africa as a framework that provides specific blueprints and limitations for state action. My argument here is that by applying democracy and regime concepts to ECOWAS, its rules, norms, principles that must be adhered to by member states, that will continue or can contribute to deepening democracy. However, we are seeing a development over time where non-compliance, even by democratically elected regimes, is contributing to leading to either coercive or other forms of responses. Therefore, the coups in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso is raising critical questions about the effectiveness of ECOWAS's regime, its credibility, and the levels of bindingness relating to the extent to which this regime can elicit compliance from its own member states. Furthermore, I argue that to achieve the change in state behavior that ECOWAS is looking for, it must begin a process of implementing its own rules and regulations in a manner that is fair, transparent, responsive, and time-bound. To do this, some of the factors which can contribute to ensuring this regime's effectiveness and preventing the surge in coups d'etats are the manner in which its rules are framed, the manner in which its binding provisions are applied, and the mechanisms by which the rules must be revised. And I think rule revision here is increasingly becoming important as Abuja is struggling to respond to this spate of coups. My concluding point is that the effectiveness of ECOWAS's democracy regime in preventing the coups that we are seeing from spreading hinges on the extent to which a combination of institutional attributes and mechanisms are developed, first, to motivate member states in complying, and secondly, to associate actors in ways that encourages modification in their conduct and in their understanding of democracy and how it must be played out. Thank you.
Professor Anning, appreciate this input from your side, stressing why the catalysts of the coups are, but also stressing how do we have to look at dealing and responding with them, as opposed to the idea that one has to come up with brilliantly new ideas, but rather to use what is available and build upon it. I think we can take one question. Professor Anning kept to his time. We can take one question from the floor. If you can put up your hand, then you can speak. One question. Right. Right, we can move on to the first panel where Professor Anning will be the chair, and there we can listen to Professor Esterhuizen, Stellenbosch University, Professor Mandrup, RDDC and Stellenbosch, and Professor Dirkotse from the University of South Africa to add on to what we've listened to now, but from perhaps some different perspective. Each speaker has approximately 5 to 7 minutes, after which we can have a type of a discussion led by the chair and 1 or 2 questions. So, Professor Anning, I want to hand over to you, and then the first speaker, Professor Esterhuizen, if you can join up and work with Professor Anning on this.
Well, thank you very much, Francois. So 5 to 7 minutes. And Professor Estelle, if you are ready, your 5 minutes to 7 minutes starts now.
Let's open it up here. You give me a minute. I just want to set this up quickly because I have a clip or two that I want to show here. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this. I sort of accept and work on the assumption, and you have already proven me right, Professor Anning, that there will be people that will have much more knowledge about the Sahel that I have, and also that there's people who will cover the political domain. So my expertise in strategic studies and in the military domain. And this is what I want to focus on this afternoon. I'm also going to be fairly theoretical in nature, for no other reason than I want to highlight what I consider to be the key variables that we need to talk about if we talk about the problem of coup d'etats in the Sahel region. And I want to start off with 2 clips that I often use in class to talk to my students about the civil-military divide and the civil-military realities. Let me just put my camera on, sorry, if you want to see me. This is quite interesting, and it demonstrates to some extent the interface between the military and the political realities in Africa when you look at what is unfolding often within countries. The second clip that I want to use is this clip from Australia, and I want you to take note of what the chief of the Australian Air Force or the Australian military is doing here. So these two clips is giving us some insight into the problems of getting it right, getting the balance between and the interface between the military and the political domains within countries and manage it. And then my argument, I want to sort of work with two assumptions this afternoon. I think this is important that we talk about this. I want to work with the assumption, and I think this is part of what we need to talk about, that coup d'etats in Africa in particular and in the Sahel region as well often unfolds where you have an interface or an overlap between the lack of good governments, the lack of military professionalism, and then a very important third factor, the lack of development and economic prosperity. And the moment you bring those three variables together and or the absence thereof and you find it within a country, you automatically raises the potential for coup d'etats in Africa. A second assumption that I think we ought to debate and work with is the political military interface and an understanding that I think we need to challenge the Huntingtonian notion of a clear divide between the political and the military domain, because the moment you draw a clear line of demarcation and you try and isolate these domains and they start operating on their own, you find yourself in difficulty, because then you start getting a disconnect in what I want to call the Clausewitzian trinity. In your normal democratic theory, you have a government that is elected to serve society. And of course, the security institutions ought to provide protection to government, to both the government and the polity. That's normal democratic theory in typical the articulation thereof in the Huntingtonian understanding of civil military relations. However, what we often find in Africa is that the essence of what is unfolding within countries is the importance of the government and the polity that is often protected by the security institutions. And the security institutions then often becomes a divide between society and government, or that the security institutions then threaten either policy or rather the polity, government, or the society. And if you consider this triangle, this Clausewitzian idea of people, society, and government, and you think about how Hugh Smith explains this as the interface between people and government ought to provide you with good policy. The interface between government and the military underpins good strategy, and that military employment is, to some extent, and often the dichotomy between your military in your security institutions and people. And then you need to ask the question, but where is the problem in Africa? Is the problem in the policy domain? Is the problem in the strategic domain? Or is the problem in the military domain? Where is the problem in the state in Africa? So from a civil military perspective, then looking at the interface between the military, society, and the government, Mattei argues that there's three variables that one has to consider: the control variable, the effectiveness of the military, and of course the efficiency, the budgets within the military domain. What is interesting for me then, she argues that if you look at democratic control, there's three critical issues that one has to talk about. institutional control mechanisms, parliament, formal agencies. But the critical thing for me that I think is often problematic in Africa is what I want to call the oversight by independent agencies. The media, NGOs, think tanks, trade unions, those independent agencies that are critical in the civil military interface in Africa. And then, of course, the professional norms. And I will say something about the professional norms. Military effectiveness, just want to touch on this, she argues is often the outcome of doable and affordable strategies and plans that's often lacking in Africa. A well-functioning meritocratic structure and processes within the armed forces, and of course then well-resourced, and let us turn to defense budget. But I want to highlight a very important reality pertaining to African militaries and coup d'etats in particular. And this is the argument.
1 minute, please.
I have.
1 minute.
Do I have 1 minute? This is the weakening of African armed forces through subnational ethnic recruitment, through corruption, through personal loyalties, through reliance on foreign protection, and often also domestic deployment, those 5 critical realities. So let me conclude. I want to argue that a specter is haunting African militaries, and that's the specter of peace. That very often, and I will elaborate later on about that, but also Africa to some extent is under-militarized and lacking in military security. And for peace in Africa, Africa needs more professional armed forces. That's as wide as the Lord's grace, but yeah, I've said a lot of things for us to talk about.
Well, thank you very much, Abel. I'll now call on Professor Mandrop to speak to us for 5 to 7 minutes. Thomas.
Yeah. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you much. I think actually the 2 previous speakers has actually made it easier for me. What I've tried to do here in my 5 to 7 minutes is to just a sec. I need to get to this. Here we are. Sorry. It's just to try to lose Thomas Sankara and the tradition of military coups, the left-wing military coups, as an example and a lens to try to understand the contemporary coups in West Africa. Because as was mentioned previously, we have a governance crisis, we have a democratic crisis. I will even go so far to say that we've had elite hijacking of so-called democratic processes. So we've had pseudo-democratic processes, and they are now unwinding. And again, under pressure from internal Islamic groups and radicalization and external pressure, as Professor Ning mentioned about the strategic battle between international powers and all that taking place in West Africa, making use of this. We can talk about locality in this kind of sense. But basically, we can say that what we see, the coups we see, is also a product of this elite hijacking of so-called democratic processes. I will come back to that. But as Professor Nings mentioned, we have seen an increase in number of military coups and then coup attempts in recent years. And that, of course, raises the question why we need to talk about this in this amount. One thing could say, what is it that if we look at the Sahelian and the West African coups currently, what is it that make them maybe different from what we've seen before? In top right corner, we have Idi Amin, we have Bokassa, we have Idi Amin and Mobutu Sese Seko in the left corner. Then we, of course, have Thomas Sankara, and we have Colonel Goita, sorry, from Mali in left top corner. One could say that back then, the coups were a product of corrupt military, unprofessional militaries in a difficult time, in a transition from the colonial past. What we have seen now, and that's where, and then also I think Professor Ning alluded to this, we've seen now in a period of time after the end of the Cold War, where we have had this democratic processes, we have all the ECOWAS principle of normal entrepreneur, on being under good governance, democracy in West Africa, trying to build up these kind of things. We've had especially Western donors, EU, in UN, a lot of other international actors going in and try to promote this kind of what one could say, democratic elections and all that. The problem, of course, is that if we look at the elections in West Africa, and then especially in these countries, often these so-called democracies are very urbanized, and urbanized elites who connect and control the political process, which we see. The social contract between which should be in a society has maybe never existed because the elites have served themselves. Often the political parties are also parties that can manipulate the democratic processes in the way that we get this hybrid democracy kind of situations where the elites secure that they keep in position and control, have monopoly on the situation, all that. And when the pressure then comes from insurgencies like we see in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger and other places, or economic crises are following the COVID pandemic and all that, suddenly these elites are not able to keep things together, and they dismantle within when they put under pressure. And then one can argue that one thing that's then the military then becomes is that we talk about, and Abel mentioned this thing about the ideal about militaries being under civilian control, and then the role of society being apolitical and things like that. And here one could say that the younger generation, now the younger officers, may be seeing the consequences of these corrupt processes, take the power to change the society. And that's why I bring in the principle of Thomas Sankara, because one could say that what he talked about was a genuine transformation of society, in a genuine way of changing the structures in society that keeps the majority of people in poverty and outside the influence. And where therefore the military in that sense can be a reformist kind of tool that actually goes in and disrupt the structures in society as a part of this real democratic process in the longer term, if we believe that's what they are doing. But because one can say that every time the West comes and say, now Mali, you have to have elections, and we have to have elections in a situation where the country is not ready for it, and where again it's hijacked by elites. We see what's going on the political process, for instance, in Bamako at the moment, where existing political elites are now talking to the JNIM and others and trying to establish some kind of control. And the risk, of course, being that they will go all the way and go back, and it's the same people, the same families that have always been in control that actually hijack the process once again, and all that. So how do we? Which of course was why the military reacted to this. So so the consequence here being that the defense forces can be seen also, this can be seen as a consequence of failed democratic processes. It can be seen as a tool to try to make disruptions, to try to do creative things, as Thomas Sankara says. We have to do creative things to change things. So disruption becomes a strategy to try to disrupt what is going on. Then, of course, we have all the other things I know with Russia and all coming in and all that. Yeah, and I better stop here. Thank you. My time's up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, Thomas. I think you've raised some really very important points for further discussion. But without much further ado, let me invite Dirk to share his thoughts with us before we open the floor for conversation.
Good. Thanks very much, Chair. I'm going to address, or want to address, the topic of our panel, which is about why are Sahel countries so prone to military coups. Now, I think first of all, one should acknowledge that the Sahel is an area which is very diverse. The Sahel of the East, around Sudan and Ethiopia, is very different from the Sahel in West Africa. So I think the focus is mainly on the western part of the Sahel, but we should not forget about the eastern part and the fact that the prevalence of coups are less on the eastern side than on the western side. I think what is I want to try to identify in the short few minutes from a more political science point of view, what might be some of the explanations for this. And none of them that I'm going to mention or raise here are meant to be explanatory in their own right. So I would like to put them on the table and see to what extent we can get some form of a framework maybe in place about understanding coups in a more general sense. The first point that I want to raise is that if we look especially at the western side of the Sahel, is that the states there are predominantly a combination of French and in some cases Arabic-speaking states. That applies more to those on the eastern side, like the Sudan, together with the Muslim faith. The majority of the persons living in these countries are Muslims. And because of this combination, and I think what I try to do is to look at some structural aspects that can provide some explanation of why are coups being more prevalent maybe in this part of the world than, for example, in Southern Africa or other parts of Africa, is that this model, mainly a French constitutional model, is very much that of a centralized state. It is a secular state at the same time, which is challenged by the Muslim movements with a theocratic state model. Now, we all know that the traditional mandate of the military, of the defense forces, is normally that of defending the state. So if one looks at it from this point of view, then it means that the military itself sees itself as a defender of the state as it is defined at the moment, and not so much as that in terms of the challenges. A second point, which I think might be relevant for our discussion, is the French security tradition, coming from the colonial times, obviously. That is more focused on the military and the semi-military, or the gendarme, Turkey they talk about gendarmerie tradition of civil policing. So it means that when we look even at the role of the police, because I think it is important that we must compare the role of the military on the one hand with the role of the police, the civil police on the other hand, that in countries coming from a more of a French tradition, the police even is militarized, especially in terms of the gendarme tradition, which is in many parts of the world. Therefore, it means that the military, that the civil police, in a sense, is not responsible for domestic security, but rather a militarized form of it, whether it is the military per se, the defense force, or the militarized police. And that they are, therefore, the military is not only responsible for transnational or international purposes or security of the state. A third element, which I think might be relevant in order to understand what are the dynamics in the Sahel, and specifically in the western part of it, is that almost all those countries that are prone to coups have a very strong tradition of presidentialism. At the same time, because of the strong presidentialism, a tradition of relatively weak parliaments, weak political parties, which means that they don't provide actually a political alternative for unpopular governments. So the focus is very much as a result of that on the president, and coups are very often aimed at the president as a person, at the office of the president, the individual of the president, who is a very easy target, because it's not like in countries with more of a parliamentary system where political power is more diverse, it is more distributed, It is more decentralized, where a coup is very difficult to stage. I mean, for example, someone who became one of the leading ANC ministers after 1994 asked me, why is it so difficult to stage a coup in South Africa, or was it in the past? And I think this is one of the explanations for that it is not just centered in one person who can be removed and then there's an overthrow of the government to a large extent. At the same time, I think what is very important is that the military is also regarded as a secular force. It therefore defends the secular notion of the state compared to, as I said, the theocratic or other forms of or definitions of the state. So the military becomes automatically seen as part of the status quo. But what is, I think, what one should not assume is that there's coherence between the political side, the presidential component, the civilian, the side of the political domain, and that of the military. So it is not as if there is an absolute symbiotic relationship between the two. Another factor which I think which is not always very prominent in the debate about coups is that some coups are caused by or takes place aimed at transitional governments or interim governments. Think about the one in the Sudan of Dr. Hamdok. Several of us know him while he was here in South Africa, or in Burkina Faso in 2015, where it was transitional governments that became unpopular, that led to some social unrest, and as a result of the instability in those countries, the military moved in. I think that the last point that I want to raise is when we look at coups mainly in response to a sense of insecurity, that the military is there to try to restore security and therefore overthrow or take over political power, is that in the Sahel, I suspect one can say there's more than just the insecurity because of religious and jihadist movements there. That is one important aspect of it, but there's also others. One of them is, for example, the contest for land and the use of land from an agricultural point of view. And then lastly, it's about the autocratic natures of presidents per se. So one cannot therefore, I would argue, not reduce it simply to an insecurity because of the religious or the Muslim extremism that exists in the Sahel. So I would argue, therefore, in conclusion, that one should have a more political analysis in order to understand also some of the security concerns or some of the security factors that ostensibly contribute directly to military coups in the Sahel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dirk, and thank you very much to all the speakers for their contributions, sharp, straight to the point. I'm not really going to try to summarize, but there were about 3 or 4 points that stuck out. First relates to Abel's point about peace needing a professional army. That to be able to stabilize these countries, the army itself must be professional. But it makes a tangential point about security force assistance and the way in which foreign assistance might also contribute to this. Thomas's point about elite capture and the way in which that either strengthens or undermines the social contract, and trying to use a Sankarist lens to explain the narratives that quite a number of these young coup leaders are using, opens new opportunities, to understand how a reformist language is used by some of these militaries. Dirk's point, I think, brings another very interesting dimensions to the conversation about autocratic presidential, systems of governance, the French forms of the post-colonial French state, but also that I think the argument about strong presidential systems running roughshod, even in cases where there are parliaments, there are oversight rules and oversight mechanisms, as laying the foundation for some of the changes that we are seeing becomes or makes a very interesting point. So those who want to argue, I think we have just about 15 minutes. Short points, either contributions or specific questions, kindly raise your hands and I'll be very happy to recognize you and give you the point, the chance. Yes, I think Morosi.
Thank you very much, Bob. And then thank you to all the speakers. My question is twofold. And the first part of it goes to, I think, Thomas, who attempted to use the Sankarian lenses to better conceptualize the phenomenon of coups in West Africa. And the question thereof is, you might be aware that currently some people are actually hailing the current leader. I think it's Traoré, the current military leader in Burkina Faso, and some even going as far as comparing him to Sankara in his charismatic nature and, having staged what they deem as a leftist type of coup. And so my question would be, what is your take on that argument? The second part of it is, in relation to what we saw during that wave of coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and in other countries, where we saw the youth and general population, jubilating and quite excited when these coups were being staged. And this really goes to Prof. Anand to say, what do you think? Why do you think the population, the youth specifically, seemed to be that sympathetic to the coup leaders, and what does that really imply? What does it mean for the democracy trajectory in West Africa? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I will now invite Thomas to give a very short answer.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. I think we have to wait and see. Right now, Traoré and Burkina Faso is so much under pressure that at the Accra Forum, the Minister of Defense for Burkina Faso, he stated that 40% of Burkina Faso is under control of Islamic insurgents at the moment. So we will have to wait and see whether he has these reformist ambitions, and that will take time. Is he there because he wants to grab power? Is he there because he wants to really change society and as in the way Sankara says? We have to wait and see. I think the jury's still out there. Just a comment on the youth, if I may, Kwesi. I think also we have to if we're careful about the youth. I was in Bamako doing fieldwork here recently, and Eurovolo, the youth organization, the leader there is payrolled by Russia. So also sometimes the youth and sometimes these are also instrumentalized tools that the elites use to serve their purpose. So to what extent there is some support, no doubt about it, but to what extent this is a real genuine thing, or how much some of these is orchestrated from other places, one has to be careful when we do this kind of analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As short, brief, very, very good. Let me start with the Sankarist question. I think, as Thomas says, we need to wait and see, because Sankara has been elevated to a near demigod status in Burkina Faso, in which, appropriating the language of Thomas Sankara, sending signals about recreating this era of optimism and hope and a new self-identification, then gives you a certain level of popular support. I mean, the narratives around the youth about exclusion, about a certain desire to participate in national, politics, all very useful. But my true concern here is to begin to understand the roles or the multiple roles of external agencies who may not necessarily be interested in some of Diek's point in strengthening and Abel's point in strengthening the democratic process. I mean, we've seen how the Russians particularly are using, fake news in providing a particular narrative that appeals to the youth. In Burkina Faso, for example, when the French embassy was touched or burnt down, and a couple of other violent instances, it was very difficult for the youth leaders themselves to explain how youth groups had become so violent so rapidly. So I think the developments are so tenuous and constantly transforming, so we need to be a little bit more patient and, of course, have a very critical eye on how things are developing. Thank you. Yes, please. I think Mushonga and Juliet. So Mushonga first and then Juliet.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to all the speakers for this insightful discussion. I have a comment and a question. Question first, actually directed to the chair, Professor Anin. I think in your presentation, you did indicate that if by June 2023 we have another coup, that would mean the end of democracy. I was looking for some kind of qualification or quantification, about that statement to say what does that mean? Is it about quantity? Is it about what? So maybe I may have missed it, but I would love to know, why June 2023 and the death or end of democracy, and probably whose democracy. And then a comment it's just a general comment, especially which I picked from on the basis of the opening of this webinar by the Dean. I don't know whether it was maybe slip of the tongue or just a sweeping statement where he said that, coups in some parts of Africa have now become some standard practice. And I was wondering, I wish he was here maybe to qualify on that, but it's a comment. But my problem is that, no matter, what happens elsewhere or anywhere else, we cannot normalize probably things that are not normal, war by its nature, I don't think it's a normal thing, and we cannot normalize it or naturalize it. So maybe someone, I don't know whether the chair or someone can comment on that to say, if something has become some kind of standard practice. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Juliet, please, to ask a question or make a comment, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. Mine is a question, and first of all, let me thank Prof. Kwesi and all those who have commented, Prof. Abel and Thomas, on your contribution towards this issue of coups, extremism, and poor governance that we are challenged with in our continent. First of all, I just wish to register that, in fact, when Prof. Kwesi was presenting, my anger was going up and up, not because of his presentation, but looking at how the whole issue of coups, extremism, and poor governance is affecting women and children in Africa. And I believe we know that For several times we have heard many girls being captured, kidnapped, and we remember very well the issue which happened in Nigeria specifically, where a number of girls were captured from Chibok school and were taken into wherever were taken to by these army people and being used as their sexual objects, preventing these girls from school. So my question specifically to Prof. Quest is that I know this is your area of specialization, and a person of your caliber, I know you have sat in different forums, different committees, summits, discussing about this issue of coups and extremism. Can you shed light on what some of these governments in Africa are doing in order to, to prevent this issue of, inflicting pain in women and girls in Africa because of the power hunger that are there in our African leaders? Do you know any of interventions which are happening in any of the countries that this issue of coups are happening? And I know that even here in South Africa, it is now spilling over to Southern Africa, where even our neighboring country in Mozambique, recently there was that coup which happened where women and children are suffering, they are displaced and all those. What are our governments doing in Africa about the whole issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juliet. I will take another question from Colin, and very briefly, we have just about 1.5 minutes left, so all the speakers can also give a very quick response.
All right, thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity, and thanks to the panel for such insightful presentation. My question is not a long one. Basically, I'm interested to know the extent to which this military coup can serve as a solution to the existing security threats within both the Sahel region and West Africa in large. Because of, we know that these two regions are heavily characterized by the rise of insurgents, especially in the Sahel, whereby we've seen groups such as Al-Qaeda affiliates and Jenin launching a wave of terror against civilians. And to a larger extent, these terrorist groups have filled in the vacuum that has been left by poor leadership or absence of government. And in this case, terrorist organizations have filled in this vacuum by providing public goods to vulnerable communities. So with this being the case, it has resulted to part of Sahel region glorifying and perhaps giving legitimacy to these insurgent groups because of they can provide public goods where the governments are failing. And when we look into the manner in which our military leaders assume power, they assume power under the pretext of providing security to the people. So I was asking, to what extent can these military leaders provide security to constituents within these two regions, especially as they are characterized by high insecurity threats? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Colin. I will now give 1.5 minutes to each of the speakers. Dirk, Thomas, in that order, and then Abel. And then I will just try to sum up in 30 seconds or so and answer some questions. So Dirk, please.
Thanks, Chair. I think from, based on my presentation of my arguments, the military is not, cannot provide security as an alternative for civilian government. It is, in a sense, it is seen, I think, by many in countries where there's not strong political institutions as a de facto opposition party. And hopefully they can do. But the military has never been able, will not be able, it's not their function, it's not their mandate, to be able to act as if they are similar to that of a civilian government or any government. So in that sense, I think the the hope that they can provide security, that they can provide an alternative for a dysfunctional civilian government is far-fetched. It is something which simply cannot happen. The changes in countries in order to solve these will be of that of economic and political reform, of changing of state institutions, of becoming more democratic in it. And that is why we see these different patterns all over the continent. There's hardly any, I can't think of any coup that has happened in a democratic country. And therefore, I think that in itself is, for me, the ultimate sort of litmus test of to what extent a coup has any function, whether it is from a Sankara point of view or from a more traditional military point of view. It simply comes back to the same issue. The military is not, they are not trained, they are not empowered, they don't have the mandate to follow the role or to play the role of a civilian government. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just on that note, actually, what Dirk just mentioned, I think, of course, the military is not a solution, but that is when the military takes power, it's because something has gone totally wrong. And back to my point what I tried to say during my presentations, that we've too long, especially now we're talking about Sahel, West Africa, have these pseudo-democratic processes where narrow elites have served their own interests and kept a monopoly on power, and when things turn sour and we have insurgencies and we have economic decline and poverty and all that, then suddenly the pressure builds up. And then some militaries within that kind of tradition, which Tom Sankara can say, now we have a chance to, in that kind of logic, that narrative, they can go in and try to change and say, we're going to throw out the whole old system, disrupt the whole thing and create something new. Whether they can do that, that's always the question, and whether they're willing to do it or they have that ambition to do it, that's always that's another discussion. But quite right, it's a civilian government and it needs to. But again, we have to make sure that it's not reproducing the same elites. Can they create security? Just look at Mali right now. Jenim is growing. I had a map, I didn't show it, but they have several attacks within a few kilometers of Bamako, increasing within the last couple months. Jenim is growing in size. Islamic State in the Sahel region is growing in size, very close to taking Menaka. The Wagner group is protecting the southern part, but it's very small. It's 1,500 troops. It cannot solve what Barkhane's 6,000 troops did. And therefore, what we're seeing right now is that the Algiers agreement is falling apart. The Algiers agreement from 2015 is falling apart. The northern rebel groups, the signatories to the agreement, is pulling the north apart. So suddenly we see the Wagner group concentrating on the economic mining industry and all that in the southern western part of Mali, together with the current government, and we see a split up and fragmentation of that. At the same time, we see a military government that is actually in secret negotiations with Jenim of some kind of transitional power. Back to the question about agenda and all that, because it suddenly means that Islamic law will be introduced, which of course is something that is actually going on at the moment. But we can talk, there's a long discussion here. So is the Wagner the solution? Is the military regimes the solutions? It doesn't seem like it. They haven't got the military capability and power, and the Wagner group is most definitely not the solutions. Just look at the Central African Republic, how bad that country is. We see what we see with right now is going to in the Central African Republic is going to happen to Mali as well, I would say. Thank you.
I'll give the word to Abel now.
Yeah, I want to tie in with what Dirk said. The question is why militaries are a problem in Africa, and I want to argue there's an interplay between two key realities. The one is the fact that, especially in the Francophonic states in Africa, you have a strong reliance and by the governments on foreign protection. They always know that France will come to the rescue, and because of that, you're often sitting with a lack of urgency in your armed forces. That's the one dynamic. The other dynamic is that armed forces, because the security of the state are not being threatened from outside, and foreign protection provide to some extent for the security of the state against foreign threats. The question then is, what precisely is the role of the military in Africa? And what you then see is that the domestic deployment of the military for partisan political reasons often becomes a key role for militaries in Africa. And I think that's part of the problem in Africa. The dichotomy between these two realities are often at the root of what we are seeing in coup d'etats unfolding in Africa. And I'm going to stop there.
Well, let me say a very big thank you.
Okay, Kwesi, we're over time. If we can keep it very short, please.
I want to thank all of you, and particularly to Juliet for bringing the gender dimensions to this. Unfortunately, our governments are not doing much. You know, they've placed women on the fringes of their security discussions and economic policies, meaning that if you take Mali and Burkina Faso, the livelihoods of women have been undermined, they've been threatened. And I think we are seeing increasingly extremist groups filling the gaps where the state has failed to deliver public goods. But there are lots of things that I think this first session has raised, and I want to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to undertake this conversation. So thank you very much, and I hand it over to you, Francois.
Kwesi, a word of thanks to you as well as to the speakers. I'll immediately drive into the next panel, because in this panel we've got Professor Sholton Giller, University of Indiana, Professor Hussein Solomon, Center for Gender and Africa Studies, Free State University, and Mrs. Annette Madansela from UNISA. What's the interface between coups, violent extremism in governance in the Sahel? That's the overarching topic for the panel. I want to ask Professor Sholton Giller if he could commence with his part, to please take up your 5 to 7 minutes. I'll stop you at 7. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. There are a lot of wonderful things that were said, and it's very complex, and some of what I was going to say has already been said. First of all, we really have to remember that most of Sahelian states have been plagued by military coups since the 70s, in the late 60s. And that's what's a problem. And one of the issues is that most of the military coups, with some exceptions, one mentioned Sankara, but Sankara didn't have the problem his country was being invaded and territory taken. So he had that advantage, and he also had the advantage of power. For the weaknesses of the new military coups is they really don't have the power. And if we look at the past, unfortunately, the rule by military coup leaders shared some of the same traits of poor governance founded in Sahelian states headed by the civilians. As you mentioned, a highly centralized state, the presidentialism, or you might call monarchism. People just don't want to leave power. The reluctance to share power with opposition groups, the political oppression of criticism and opposition, and their incompetence in actually meeting one of the major goals of government, which is provide for the general welfare of their populations. And if we look at some of the specific traits of military coup leaders, which makes it very difficult for them to accomplish very much, one is they've had lack of experience in governing and engaging in electoral politics. As a result, they often have to find allies from society, and usually they choose the same political leaders, not necessarily the leaders, but people who are willing to work with them. That's number one. Number two, the chain of command. The way in which they're trained is not really to be open to wide debate discussion. You know, the commander gives the orders, you follow the orders, and they're used to taking orders. And when they don't take orders, then you have a coup that is started by the younger political orders. So that Moussa Traore was a young political officer. He had the backing of France. Modibo Keïta regime was left. It was getting more unpopular. So he comes in. So what does he do? He becomes a civilian leader. You establish a civilian government, and he becomes the leader. And from 1968 until 1991, he's the leader there. Third, they don't have a widespread political base, so they really have to depend on charisma or just sheer force or the absence of a civil society of alternative forces in society. And then they share the same, most of them have had the same desire to remain in power and orienting resources as to support the military and their civilian actives, keep the soldiers happy, clientism to recruit supporters. They're non-accountable to civilian institutions, courts, political parties, or civil society. And the main thing they can stay in power is because they have the control and skill in using weapons, and they have the big weapons. You know, you can't go against them with machetes or rifles or hunting rifles. And in this day and age, this is what the military is getting more and more. Now, one of the causes of the military coup, and I think we need to put more emphasis on that, is the failure of Sahelian states to promote the general welfare of all of its citizens. It's no accident that the jihadists are strongest in the tri-frontier regions of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, because these were neglected by the colonial and post-colonial regimes, all of them. None of them put resources. They didn't get roads into there. They didn't put good education into there. They didn't put health into there. These people were left on their own. So these are some of the reasons why a military coup, you have to be suspicious of whether you're going to come up with another Sankara, because I don't think that Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso has the power to really change things unless he has the support of large segments of the population. Now, large segments of the population support him in fighting the jihadists, but he doesn't. Does he really have the power? And I mean power based not only on controlling arms and good military tactics, but power based on running some of the on doing things to improve society, which are some of the causes of this. We mentioned that the women and children are the greatest sufferers. One of the main problems that led to this was the misuse of the government, and part of the problem is the leaders. In Niger, there was a big scandal about millions of dollars were stolen, which was supposed to go to the army.
1 minute, please.
In Burkina Faso. So I'd like to say that one of the solutions would be to support the defeat of the jihadists, and for that you're going to need outside support, because these armies don't have the resources on their own. Have more coups and political violence elsewhere, and this is reinforced by climate change, by population growth, herder farmer institutes, growing networks of criminal networks, and these are allying themselves together and creating more and more violence. So it's a very difficult situation, and it needs the support of the people, and whatever external support one can be given to them, not to support and not to be indifferent to correcting the situation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor Giller. Professor Solomon, your 7 minutes on this topic, please.
Thank you very much,
Francois. By any indication, the Mo Ibrahim Index for African Governance, the UN Human Development Index, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, or World Bank reports, the Sahel's fragile states have failed to deliver to the people a life of dignity. Under their malevolent governance, state failure has grown apace, poverty has accelerated, societies have grown more polarized and corruption, and autocratic rule more endemic. In this atmosphere, extremism has really proliferated. Nigeria's Boko Haram, for instance, characterized the authorities in Abuja as corrupt and evil. This Islamist view is reinforced by the daily lived reality of ordinary Nigerians. Islamists in northern Mali, on the other hand, provide their fighters with a monthly stipend of $300 and also support their families, while the government in Bamako seems oblivious of the social contract they have with their citizens. The Global Terrorism Index is emphatic that, and I'm quoting it, governance is the most important factor that determines the size, the longevity, and the success of a terrorist group. So let me turn to the relationship between coups and violent extremism in the Sahel. In the capital of Ouagadougou on 30th September 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré seized power, blaming the government of Paul Henry Damiba of failing to quell the Islamist insurgency. Damiba, a former colonel who also came to power in a coup earlier that year, promised to end the militancy plaguing Burkina Faso. However, historical precedent suggests that Captain Traoré and his band of captains would be unable to stem the Islamist juggernaut. In 2012, another captain, Amadou Sanogo, staged a coup in Mali, citing the inability of the government to defeat the Islamists in the north. Mali's army, however, could not turn the tide. Only French intervention stopped Bamako falling then. Despite tremendous international military assistance, Mali has become the epicenter of jihadist violence in the Sahel. When Colonel Damiba wrested power from President Roch Kahor, he vowed to end the insurgency. By the time he was overthrown by Captain Traoré, vast swathes of territory were controlled by the Islamists. On its own, the armed forces of Burkina Faso cannot hope to turn the tide against the Islamists for the reasons essentially that Professor Esterhazy alluded to in terms of its military professionalism, in terms of the soldiers being demoralized and its armed forces is under-equipped and its logistics a mess. Professor Jalil Lounas from Morocco is of the opinion that such coups will only increase instability in the country and the region as it destabilizes the army structures and divides members of the military into supporters and opponents of the coup. Indeed, one newspaper account of the coup headlined their story as captains versus colonels. These coups have also served to undermine the legitimacy of structures and have reinforced the support for the jihadists. In the aftermath of the coup in Burkina Faso, the Al-Qaeda-linked group to support Islam and Muslims declared, and I'm quoting them, "Let the tyrants know that the repeated coups will not avail them," unquote. Moreover, when these Islamists are regionalizing and internationalizing, military takeovers harm regional cooperation. The recent coups in Mali and Burkina Faso have seen the withdrawal of French forces, as well as the withdrawal of Bamako from the Sahel G5 forces. And this has further undermined the regional fight against the Islamists. In conclusion, poor governance often lies at the root of popular disinfection, which drives recruitment into terror groups in the Sahel. The various military coups taking place in the region will not reverse the tide against the Islamists. Rather, it will add to greater social fragmentation. It will lead to growing tensions inside the military. It will do nothing for the deep challenges confronting the Sahel's military. It would further delegitimize the state, and it will contribute to greater state fragility. Whilst the military may seem best suited to prosecute the war against armed extremists, the war against
these needs a whole of society approach, and that necessitates a legitimate civilian government creating inclusive societies whilst they practice good governance. Thank you very much.
Professor Solomon, thank you for that. I particularly liked your references to the indexes. It always helps. Professor Geller, may I ask that you switch off your camera, please, until we get back. Next in line is Mrs. Sanet Maronsela from UNISA. Sanet, your 7 minutes start now, and looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Professor Frey. It's an absolute pleasure to be sharing this panel and to be participating in a discussion on the Sahel region, which is faced by unprecedented humanitarian crises. In an area that is particularly riddled with conflict, poverty, climate change, insecurity, and political stability. So the focus of my discussion will be more on governance and how governance can be improved in order to actually stop these instances. So distinguishing between good and bad governance is often challenging as the outcome rests on subjective factors on which some may never find consensus. The outcome primarily rests on how good and bad governance is measured, defined, and influenced. What we, however, can agree on is that bad governance is the antithesis of good governance, and it occurs when a nation's resources are not harnessed and distributed in a manner that benefits all. It concentrates wealth within the hands of a few, while most lack suitable and equitable shelter and food. Unemployment is high, old age care, pension, and other benefits tend to be non-existent. It allows the creation of bad policies that in turn have negative impacts on society and translate in a lack of transparency, accountability, and procedural fairness. These governance failures result in diminishing governmental legitimacy and can ultimately result in civil wars, communal conflict, the establishment of ethnical and sectoral militias, and that was exacerbated or often exacerbated by social divisions, elite fragmentations, and so on. And this can particularly be seen in the case of Mali. Resource governance in Mali was traditionally regulated by the Dina Empire, with the Fulani, who were the herdsmen, taking priority. The Boza were the fishermen, and the Dagu were the agriculturalists. This system was, however, disrupted by colonial and post-colonialism as European governance started taking priority over customary rules, thus changing the dynamics in terms of these power relations. The modernization project, for example, intensified agricultural projects, which obviously meant that you had less focus on terms of other activities. Climate change then impacted on these herds, and then resulting in a lot of changes in terms of the dynamics of the country. It is worth noting that 2/3 of Mali consists of desert terrain, and as a result, this has a big problem or big impact in terms of the country, given the fact that 2/3 of its territory is basically desert terrain and about 60% of its population located in rural areas. Additionally, agriculture tends to be the biggest supporter in terms of job creation. So the country's resource governance is often used or instrumentalized by armed forces and non-state actors, and this gives rise to banditry, self-defense militias, and extremism. And for example, by 2015, we could see that there was a rise in communal violence between the herders and the pastoralites, and this started spreading throughout the country and gave rise to violent extremism. This weak governance, political instability, food and livelihood instability also created the perfect breeding ground for rebel militias and so on. So while you had France in the Group of Five tasked with diffusing military in the violence in the country, it had little to no impact, given the fact that there were deep, more structural underlying factors that resulted and created this violent environment. And as a result, the violence continued to intensify and now is threatening regional stability. So this often raises concerns about whether it will allow groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State to establish new havens and completely destabilize the region. And I'm hoping that this is a discussion that we can have in this session. Thank you so much.
Sanet, thank you very much. Direct to the point. And I want to allow time for 2 questions from the floor. If you can put up your hand. If you have comments, please post them in the chat box and people can have a look at them. If you have comments, perhaps then you can do it there. Questions can go to the speakers, please identify yourself briefly and pose the question to the speaker that you wish to answer the question. Can we have some hands? Right, I've got one from Mr. Marno Swart. If I'm correct, please proceed.
Thank you so much, Prof, and thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. I do understand that this is perhaps not a direct link to Professor Hussein Solomon's presentation, the title, but as a previous student of Professor Hussein Solomon, I just have a question. Professor Solomon was the senior professor on international relations theory when I was in his honors class. So, Prof, I just wanted to hear from what your opinion is regarding the possibility of any external influence regarding these coups. The reason I'm asking this is I believe there was a statement made regarding military coups do not really occur in democratic states. But what about the case studies of Operation Ajax that occurred in 1953 in Iran, Operation PB Success, 1954 in Guatemala, and Project Fubelt, 1973 in Chile. I think what all of these cases have in common is that it was overthrown or it was orchestrated by the CIA. So that is just my question. Thank you, Prof.
Should I respond, Franco?
Yeah, please respond.
Yeah, look, there was speculation that there was an external hand in terms of Burkina Faso, in terms of the Russian flags, in terms of statements emanating from certain people coming from Moscow and so forth. And also, on the other side of the coin, there was the argument, of course, that the civilian governments have actually stayed in power for a very long time because of their relationship and their proximity to certain French political elites. So the issue of the outside, and given the fragility of the state, takes prominence in terms of the Sahel. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the direct answer. Then there's another one from Colin, I think Olebugong. Please proceed.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Prof. Ray, and thank you very much to the speakers for insightful presentation. To Ms. Sanet Madonsela, thank you very much for insightful presentation and sharing your narrative, ma'am. Interested to know from your point of view, provided that you've presented on issues surrounding good and bad governance. Okay, it has been highlighted clearly that the existence of bad governance in Africa has somehow perpetuated or influenced the resurgence of the recent wave of military coup in Africa. And from my side, I'd like to pose a question that we know that the African Union has adopted certain normative frameworks, such as the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Good Governance, including the Lomé Declaration of 2000, which was adopted by the Organization of African Unity. So in the midst of all this framework, we still see the resurgence of military coups. So my question is basically revolving around the intervention by international community towards handling this resurgence of military coup. What has been the AU's response and ECOWAS predominantly based on these military coups? And does their response only limited to the coup and condemning these coups, or has their response tried to mitigate the resurgence of these military coups by preventing whatever caused that lies behind the resurgence of these military coups such as bad governance? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your question, Colin. I think that the answer would be multifold. I don't think that the AU has been non-responsive in terms of the different coups, because you would note that they removed Mali after the last coup, or removed access for Mali after the last coup. I do think that a lot of the coups are because some countries have a more, I would say, a deeper history with coups where you've had military governments govern for years on end. If you take, for example, Egypt is now a democracy, but it came into being, or the former president was also part of a coup and then became the president. And they, for example, have I would say over 50, if not 80 years of military governance. So I think that that is also a factor. So it depends on a case-by-case study or a case-by-case basis. And then in terms of the mitigation, I think that a lot of the reasons why these coups are so repetitive and so on is because, as Professor Darkota mentioned, they tend to take place in transitional democracies where the state isn't as strong as it possibly can be, because I think those are much easier to overthrow than a more established and a much older democracy. So I think that's one of the other reasons. In the case of Mali, for example, the reason why they've been so successful in terms of recruiting people and so on is because there's a lot of, or lack of, service delivery. You have a lot of divisions in terms of your population. You have a lot of these people then coming in and rendering these services, and as a result of that, gaining the loyalty of the locals. So I think that we won't have a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of mitigating it. I think that there needs to be more, but I also think that international intervention doesn't always yield success. But I would think that at least if the international community was part of the discussions, that there may be solutions to the problems. Thank you.
Sanet, thank you for that. We're already pushing into panel 3. I don't want to do that too long. Professor Geller, thank you for your point-to-point outline. Hussein Solomon, Professor, thank you for that side in bringing statistics into this, and Sanet with your focus on good governance. The argument is often you can't blame bad governance for everything. Perhaps there's a good counter-argument that if you bring in good governance, you probably would address a disproportionate part of the accelerators that bring about coups and make it more difficult. Perhaps not eradicate, but perhaps mitigate the conditions that would push for coups. So with that, those last remarks, I'm going to hand over to Professor Solomon to run the last panel, panel 3 for us. Thank you, Hussein.
Thank you so much, Francois. And what's interesting, in the chat function, you will see that Professor Anne Moisson had posed a question about how to turn this around. I attempted a short answer to her question in the chat function, but I think that our two speakers now will be able to more than adequately deal with this. The first speaker is Professor Tim Moriti from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Stellenbosch University and the University of the Free State. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hussein. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. We are due to have load shedding soon, but I will do my best to make sure that I wrap up before the electricity goes off. But thanks to all the speakers, and thanks to Prof. Ray and Prof. Solomon for coordinating this very important discussion. I think it's really excellent. Part of this forward-looking panel, I think this is where we try to think of more medium, longer-term strategies to address the issues transforming these societies that are racked by violent extremism and coups going forward. So I think it's also important to just highlight very briefly that we need to always contextualize the emergence of violent extremism on the African continent. It didn't simply fall out of the sky. There is a context to this, and it's one pathway is to link it to the to the particularly U.S. military adventurism in the Middle East, the 2003 Iraq invasion, and then both Russia, US, UK, France, bombardment of Syria in 2011 that led to the incursion of these extremist groups in both North Africa, the Maghreb, Libya, we're familiar with, and then Somalia, and now Mozambique with Al-Shabaab and Ansar al-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah. So this really speaks to the militarization of Africa by geopolitical forces. And at the moment, I think we're seeing some musical chairs taking place between the Russians and the French, as the French pull out Wagner, which is, these are not angels, actually are sliding into position. And Russia now clearly has a very predatory project on the African continent. So we need to be aware of this larger contextualization as to where these forces are, in fact, being driven from. Yes, it's true. There is a collusion with African political, military, and business elites to lead to this issue. So the issue, though, is I think the counterterrorism strategies have really been over securitized, and there's a major blind spot in dealing with the root causes, the drivers, and the enablers of what we call terrorism, which is still not defined by the United Nations system, because you would find that many nation states would actually fall into the category of being terrorists towards their own people. So this speaks of the need for slightly deeper types of interventions, community engagements, and how we can actually scale that up. I think the countering extremist ideology, radicalization, and the financing of terrorism in Africa is not going to be achieved by the hard, kinetic military approaches. They do have a place, but at a certain point in time, you need to actually adopt a whole of society approach to putting in place strategies to mitigate against the spread of radicalism and extremism. These are so-called softer approaches, but I think we need to reframe that, because in fact they're the ones that will sustain peaceful societies in the long term. These are processes that encourage the surfacing of grievances, deeply entrenched grievances that lie within most of these communities. Poor governance, very clearly defined by corruption, private accumulation, ignoring the rule of law, and the need for societal engagement, much deeper societal engagement, structural reforms, institutional transformation that will actually bring about more sustainability, for the societies going forward. And in the absence of actually dealing with those issues, I think we will continue to see this democratic backsliding, the recurring coup d'etats, and the unconstitutional changes of governance, which now is the norm du jour and in our policy discourse. And so Africa also has to take a lead, I would argue, in actually trying to shape norms that move away from the hard, kinetic counterterrorism strategies to the preventing violent extremism approaches that are based on a whole of society approach. The African Union hasn't got a continental approach that actually outlines such a different strategy, but there are a number of normative frameworks. I think Colin mentioned the African Charter on Democracy. We also have the African Transitional Justice Policy, which actually speaks very directly to how to begin to disrupt the drivers that maintain these conflicts over time. You might sustain it militarily, but it will actually escalate and it will recur again. So how do we activate the glue that will hold societies together? And this is often about dealing with surfacing these grievances, as I mentioned, but also addressing the trauma and the mental harm that's been caused to these communities going forward. So this AUTJP, African Transitional Justice Policy, outlines some of these provisions in terms of determining the real underlying causes of the conflict through seeking processes of restorative and retributive justice where it's appropriate, reparations and socio-economic interventions that will really genuinely affect the lives of people at the grassroots, and institutional reforms that will protect institutions from the corruption and from the infiltration and subversion and state capture, as we say in South Africa. So I think these are elements that we need to factor into any attempts to move forward, and definitely should be part of the policy dialogues, policy recommendations that we're making. They should be featuring in the exit strategies of these forces that are now in the region, or Barkhane, exited without really having made a significant impact. Wagner is there now and certainly does not use so-called soft processes. It prefers to use kinetic approaches. And then also, how do we deal with the fact that there's this cross-border dimension to the violations, the atrocities, and how do we put in place a process that actually pursues what I would call a regional reconciliation agenda, a regional transitional justice agenda and peace-building agenda. And I think that's very important to put onto the table, and very linked closely to that is the reform of the security sector. The state's apparatus is what is being contested. And until we have a situation where, in fact, civilians have control of the armed forces, then I think we will continue to see this these incipient coups across the African continent. And then just very quickly on mental health, I think this is an area that now we need to start pushing in much more. We don't have a clear-cut sense of how to do this. In fact, in these post-conflict contexts, and we need to factor that in much more into our peace-building interventions. It's still an area of growth, even for policy institutions. Our policy institutions don't really have very clear-cut strategies of how this can be scaled down at the communal level, the national level, and all the way up to the regional level. So I think that's something that we also need to put into the table if we're really talking about breaking cycles of violence going forward. Let me stop there, Prof. Solomon, and we can have a discussion later on, hopefully, if the lights don't go off.
Thanks so much, Professor Moriti. We now have Professor Glenn Siegel from Cambridge University, Haifa University, and the University of the Free State. Professor Siegel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be participating with such a very honorable list of participants talking about a very important topic in Sahel. Diving into the deep end, I can actually say that we have four groups or four sections of groups of people. One, which is the local states, which includes local counter movements, for example, when you have a coup d'etat. The second we can call is great power competition, and that includes multinational, international organizations. So we have NATO, European Union, United Nations involved. The third set is the violent extremist organizations, which are both local as well as an extension, for example, of Middle East fundamentalism. And last but not least, we can also say it is a gray zone phenomenon where we also have, for example, smuggling, organized crime, which is global. So everything is there, and it's very hard to put your finger where we are exactly in everything. So I'm going to give a few pointers now looking forward in terms of the external actors, the way forward. And one is to learn from history. The United States, for example, in Vietnam was first as advisors, then training and equipping national armies. But after 10,000 days, it's clear that it had gone to war and hadn't won, wasn't overtly successful. And we see the same actually happening in the south of Sahel with external actors. We see first stage advisors, training, equipping. Please don't go down the same Vietnam line. What we also see is the mess that external labors leave is generally caused by a premature withdrawal. As with Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, they leave and the mess is still there. So the big question is what happens after that? Well, let's actually look at the Europeans. Well, when the going gets tough, the Europeans lower the flag and leave. This is the history of Africa par excellence. We are seeing this happening now with France in Mali and in Burkina Faso. There's a mess and they are leaving. Britain and Germany were there as well, as was in fact Cote d'Ivoire. They're part of UN and EU forces, and they're also worth leaving. But of all these, French withdrawal is a real blow because they actually undertook a very aggressive and partly successful operation against jihadist groups. The French word for vacillation is hésitation, which in English actually means hesitating to do what. So they are leaving the forces in Malawi, but they're also saying they're going to Niger. So in other words, they're just basically crossing the border, really. And we know why. Niger is where their uranium is made for source for the French nuclear reactors. That is important. We can also see an interesting thing that the European Union stands together. Echoing France, European Union's foreign chief, which is Josep Borrell, who's Spanish, announced that the EU military training mission, EUTM, would suspend its operation in Mali. Who comes in? Well, this is great power competition, Russia and China. And close behind, we also know we have a big issue with MINUSMA, the United Nations Multinational Integrated Stabilization Force in Malawi. Where's that going to end? 2023 or 2024? Brexit means outdoing the EU at the expense of Africa. So the UK is also withdrawing all of its forces from Malawi before December 2023. We can often say, as the mantra has been for many, many years, local problems equals local solutions, big question mark. Well, to what extent is the Africa Union being involved in this? And President Macky Sall has called for more solidarity by and with African nations in the Sahel. However, as already mentioned, ECOWAS, well, where's that going? ECOWAS standby force, regional force, where's that going? We can also say what's happening with the G5 Sahel. Well, Mali, we reduced from that in May 2020, so it's actually a G4 now. And the most important, largest military force in the region, or political force in the region as well, Nigeria has not participated in it. So that's also not coming as a good way forward. Mali, decade later, the more things change, the more things remain the same. And we can go through a whole long line, 2012, 2013 UN peace, EU 1,000 soldiers, 2014 Operation Bakhani, 2020 even Task Force Takuba. But Malawi is not the only example. The rest of the Sahel fares no better. And we've just seen this with Burkina Faso, which has asked France to withdraw. In fact, France is even withdrawing its ambassador to that extent. And we have a domino effect, because the domino effect, what we haven't talked about today, is Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Benin. These all are along the borders with Burkina Faso and Niger. And in fact, as we already mentioned earlier on, where are the borders? So the jihadi groups know no mention of borders. 20 years of international focus, but we can say there is certain things. UNOWAS, the UN Office of West Africa, managed by the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Forces, is about to be renewed again to 31st of January 2023. The European Union is trying, EUPM in Niger. The United States of America and NATO have expressed their concern, organized amazing conferences in Washington, D.C., especially their fear of jihadists spreading south into the Gulf of Guinea and perhaps an increase of offshore piracy there. However, prefers to keep the Marines offshore, so there will be no boots on the ground. So let's draw a conclusion of this. Evidence indicates that external actors in the form of individual European states, the European Union, the United States, and the United Nations are doing something, maybe too little too late. It is expected in 2023 that external actors, France, Germany, United Kingdom, will withdraw boots from the ground. Local regional cooperation and the African Union cannot fill the gap. So it probably isn't surprising that Sahelian leaders have turned to Moscow and maybe even to China and to mercenaries as an alternative to assist in their own survival, but often, as the case has always been since post-colonialism, at the expense of their own population. There is no sustainable development, and that sustainable development is decreasing for their own country and population. And this is now circular, because the moment the Russians come in, the French leave. So I'll open up that for a discussion at that point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Siegel. Colleagues, the floor is now open. So if you have any questions I see there is, I think, Jay Emil, your hand is up. Would you mind posing?
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Just to go back a couple of sentences, the gentleman shared that the instability in Burkina Faso could spill over into those neighboring coastal countries. Is there any signs of that at the moment? Because the instability in Burkina Faso, we've also come to hear that it's also spread from like Mali and Niger. So is there a real possibility of Ivory Coast, Benin, Ghana, going up the coast being as volatile as well?
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Siegel, just hold on for 1 second. There's another question from Professor Sheldon Geller, and then perhaps you can take both you and Professor Moriti. Professor Geller, the floor is yours, sir.
What do you say about Senegal? Because Senegal is one of the examples where they have a professional army, stable government, and they've made advances for the population, and the way in which Senegal was able to push Yahya Jammeh out, their alliances with Mauritania to fight against terrorism. Is that a possibility to expand something like that, and how would one do it?
Professor Siegel, would you mind going first, and then we will bring in Prof. Moriti?
In short, what we actually have to consider throughout the inter-region is A, logistics, B, the location of local state forces, and C, the ability, therefore, to actually contain this. So there are no definable or defensive borders. Two, if you're looking at any country which is strong in the region, whether it be Senegal or Nigeria, by the time they actually reach a border to defend it, it's going to be too late. As we often saw with the case of when Chad invaded Sudan, is that your home country does not even have the logistics to go forward. You have to wait until the enemy reaches your capital before you can actually even begin to think of defending. And if you are actually looking at what we are looking at, the phenomena, what I call violent extremist organizations and the gray zone, is that it's gradual sleepage, slow step, subversive activities which are not direct military confrontation. And this is the modus operandi of violent extremist groups and criminal activities. So by the time that your strong military, your strong governance like Senegal or Nigeria realizes it's there, it's maybe too late. And the recruitment is actually done in the local population as well. So there is going to be seepages. And it's going to be very, very difficult to prevent those seepages. And it's going to be very, very difficult to deploy armed force per se to stop that. And this is often we say psychological operations, influence of social media on local population. And this is how they gained that foothold in the first instance. So I'd say it's going to be very hard, and it's going to be local solutions on that, because no external foreign intervention on the way forward is going to be able to prevent that. The same is the religious, the ideological, the development, the weather, the climate. There are so many factors involved that even the most stable of country can be susceptible to downfall without them even knowing that.
Thank you, Professor Siegel. Professor Moriti, can you come in?
Sure, yes. Thank you. Let me just comment on the spillover question. I think the spillover is not even not in question. It will eventually happen. The moment the coastal states next to the Sahel region are very concerned, Ghana, Togo, about potential spillage and spillover of the extremism. We have precedents of spillage in Somalia, the Somali crisis, the Al-Shabaab moved into Kenya with attacks in Uganda, Ethiopia. We have in Mozambique that link with Tanzania, and now potential spread to the southern part of Africa. So spillage and the cross-border attacks are inevitable, not even a question of if, but when. So this is why it's important to work on cross-border processes, on regional approaches to actually contain and mitigate the emergence of these violent extremists, and through the so-called softer approaches, the actually communal engagement. The borderlands become crucial in this regard, because that's where the state sometimes even doesn't exist. I think we've had a meeting before where we talked about ungoverned spaces, and it's therefore up to the people, in a sense, to almost drive their own intervention processes to surface the issues, build a stronger solidarity, mitigate the spread of radicalism. I think that is something that we should factor in, and these are all spelled out, by the way, as I mentioned before, in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. Yeah, Prof. Solomon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Prof. Moriti. Thank you, Prof. Siegel, for that. Colleagues, I'm going to end this session and I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Francois Frey for the closing remarks. Professor Frey, I just would like to thank you for partnering with the partnering SIGLA with the Center for Gender and Africa Studies. And so the floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just do a few concluding remarks, starting off with thank you to the speakers and thank you to the delegates. We had 90 people that registered for this online, and we ran to around about 39 at the max. So it had some interest and got some traction through the people that met up with us today. So thank you very much for your time. Secondly, this topic, it's a difficult one, it's a tough one, posing questions. Do we know about a coup that is people first centered? Do we know about coups in Africa where the idea is that people are first and it came from a professional military? Are coups in fact done because good governance, people first agendas do not align and in fact threaten elitist and military elites in what they want to meet and what they want? Well, we had information today that answers some of those questions to an extent. A last point from our side, Professor Thomas Mundrup is here and he's busy working very hard at a longer-term project on APSA, the Africa Peace and Security Architecture. And I think that in the set of activities around that could come onto line later this year, that is the ideal opportunity to take a closer look, how to prevent, and if prevention doesn't work, how to respond in a more coherent and determined fashion to those conditions that lead to coups and probably conditions that type of draw in international actors, because there's a trend that the international actors become more of a problem than a solution, and probably is more of a problem in a solution, and that we don't get the setup where people of a country are left with bad options. Is it about the military junta that you have to live with? Do you have to live with the French? And do you have to live with the Wagner Group? Or do you have to live with all three of them because nowhere there's a solution to get out of this conundrum? So from our side, thank you very much. I'm going to turn off the recording now. Enjoy your day, enjoy your weekend. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen.